Alright, we're going to get started. Hi, my name is Kate Norwalk, and I'm a first-year postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Developmental Science, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eric Youngstrom, our speaker for today. Dr. Youngstrom earned his doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Delaware and completed his pre-doctoral internship training at Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, before joining the faculty at Case Western Reserve University. He is currently a professor of psychology and psychiatry here at UNC Chapel Hill and also the acting director of the Center for Excellence in Research and Treatment of Bipolar Disorder. Dr. Youngstrom is a licensed psychologist who specializes in the relationship of emotions and psychopathology and the clinical assessment of children and families. He actively investigates ways of improving the use of clinical assessment instruments, particularly as it relates to bipolar disorder across the lifespan. Dr. Youngstrom has spoken on the topic of pediatric bipolar disorder at scientific meetings across the world and across the country, and is currently on the Education Committee and the Research Committee of the International Society for Bipolar Disorders. Dr. Youngstrom has published more than 180 peer-reviewed publications, and he has served as an ad hoc reviewer on more than 60 prominent psychology and psychiatry journals. He has also been principal or co-investigator on more than $30 million in funded projects, including a 5-year grant from the National Institute of Mental Health and a second multi-site RO1, both designed to improve the assessment of bipolar disorder in diverse community samples. Dr. Youngstrom is the first recipient of the Early Career Award from the Division of Child and Adolescent Clinical Psychology and is an elected full member of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. He has consulted on the 5th revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and the International Classification of Diseases, and he chairs the work group on child diagnosis for the International Society for Bipolar Disorders. We are very happy to have him here today, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Youngstrom.
Thank you. Thank you for the very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. It is a thrill to be here today talking with the Center for Developmental Science, and I'm excited about this talk because it's going to be very different from what I usually do. It's not going to be talking very much about what my group specifically has been doing. It is taking an opportunity to step back and think about if we looked at bipolar disorder through a developmental science lens, what would it look like, and does that give us ideas about what directions we want to go next? It's my privilege to be here today talking with you all. I'm part of a very large team that's been working together for more than a decade to try to better understand mood disorders across the life cycle. A lot of the work has been funded by our tax dollars. I also want to disclose that I consult with Lundbeck Pharmaceuticals to give them advice about neurocognitive measures and mood measures for epilepsy and mood trials. I have no other financial relationships or conflicts of interest to disclose. The title for the talk is Hunting Chimera, and if you're up on your Greek mythology, Chimera was a monster that would attack travelers on the road to Athens or Thebes, but he wasn't just a typical monster. He was a badass monster that combined all of the worst features of other ordinary run-of-the-mill monsters. So Chimera had the head of a lion, but also a dragon, and his tail was a poisonous snake. So he's combining the venom and the aggression and the teeth of all other much more ordinary monsters. And pediatric bipolar disorder is like that in child mental health. It has all of the inattention, all of the impulsivity of ADHD, but all of the aggression and violent behavior of conduct disorder, and all of the hopelessness and despair of depression, all wrapped up into one unholy mess. But like Chimera, other people are like, Chimera? That's a myth. Doesn't even exist. I've been to Thebes many times, ain't never seen Chimera. And that's really where the field has been with bipolar disorder. People who believe in it say, this is one of the nastiest things that I have to work with in children and teenagers. And other people say, my father's favorite expression, bull feathers. I don't even believe that it exists. The diagnosis has been very controversial. This is not a fringe discussion. This is not a tiny academic debate. This is something with huge public health ramifications. So this is the most famous slide in the whole deck. This is an analysis of billing data that Moreno and Olson did, and you've heard about this on NPR. You have read about this in the New York Times. over a 20-year period, there was a 40-fold increase in the rate of diagnosis of bipolar disorder in children and adolescents. Genes don't change that fast, and the United States has not gotten 40 times worse in terms of the environment that these children are growing up in. So this is a huge change in how practitioners are thinking about these problems. Now, this change in clinical diagnosis also coincides with changes in our instructions as clinicians about how we're supposed to think about these disorders, how we're supposed to make a diagnosis. So over this time period that Moreno is looking at, we moved from DSM-3R to DSM-4, which added new types of bipolar disorder. It added a category of bipolar 2. It added a category of bipolar not otherwise specified. So we're adding additional definitions over the same period of time that we're seeing a change in the rate of diagnosis. This is intriguing because May of this year, the American Psychiatric Association just released DSM-5, and we have no idea how these new definitions are going to change the rates of diagnosis in clinical practice. 10 years ago, when I started doing talks on this topic, it was kind of neat because you could review the entire literature on the topic in a weekend. I'm not saying it was a great weekend, but it wasn't a huge literature. And now, and what I would be saying over and over at a talk like this is, we don't know yet. More research is needed. More research is needed. Now we have the opposite problem. We have too much information. There are more than 1,500 peer-reviewed articles. If you go to PubMed and type in bipolar disorder and children or adolescents or pediatric, 1,700 hits this morning. We can't review that all. Fasten your seatbelts. We're going to do about 150 articles a minute for the next, no, we're going to do a very high-level summary of this literature. So my goals for the talk are to start off by talking about, do we have any data indicating that bipolar disorder exists in children? And for most of my career, that would be the entire day. I have a 7-hour version of this talk that I do at the American Psychological Association, ABCT, at clinical meetings. So I could spend 7 hours saying, here are the data suggesting, but I'm going to give a very quick summary of that. I'm going to give a very quick summary of, are we sure that we're talking about the same thing? When we use the B word, talking about a child or a teenager, are we talking about the same thing when we're seeing this in adults? Why are we hearing about it more in the United States? But what I want to spend more than half of the time doing is rethinking bipolar disorder through a developmental psychopathology lens. So the way that the field has approached this is largely the way that a psychiatrist would approach this. So when you want to validate a disorder, the classic in medicine and psychiatry would be to use the Robinson-Guzet framework. This is the framework, that 1970 paper was in the American Journal of Psychiatry saying, are we sure that schizophrenia exists? How would we approach validating this construct? And they came up with 5 different types of research that they say if we can demonstrate each of these 5 things, if all of these studies, they don't use the words nomothetic network like we would, but this was their way of trying to converge on, we think that schizophrenia is a real entity. And the rest of psychiatry ever since then has said, well, it worked for schizophrenia, so let's try this with our disorder. So careful clinical description, laboratory studies, which in 1970s would not have included neuroimaging and a lot of the neurocognitive tests that we're using now. Exclusion of other disorders, follow-up studies, and family studies, which now would include lots of genetics, both GWAS and genes of interest studies. And summarizing 1,500 peer-reviewed articles, Geller and Biederman and Finling have all written review papers saying when we take that framework, looking for these 5 types of studies, we see dozens to scores of articles that have been published in each of these categories supporting the validity of a diagnosis of bipolar disorder in children and teenagers. For those of you who have been following this area, it's striking because these 2 people really don't like each other. They disagree vehemently a lot in public, and they agree, no, we've accumulated a lot of evidence. Even if Geller would say, even if we threw out everything that Boston has done, we still have a lot of data. And Boston would say, even if we threw out everything St. Louis has done, we still have a lot of data supporting the validity of this diagnosis. We have imaging studies now. And what's really neat in 2013 is that there are meta-analyses and systematic reviews that are starting to come out integrating this literature. So Steve Strakowski just published a review paper in Bipolar Disorders looking at 300 papers in imaging across the life cycle. Patty Walshaw published a review looking at neurocognitive tasks. And the quick summary of this slide is bipolar disorder impairs your cognitive functioning. Very similar in a lot of ways to what we would see deficits in with ADHD, but it looks like ADHD and then a little bit worse. When we compare bipolar disorder to schizophrenia, the deficits that we're seeing across neurocognitive measures for bipolar disorder fall somewhere in between ADHD and schizophrenia in terms of severity. When I started doing talks on this, I would say the million-dollar question is, what will these kids look like 2 years later, 3 years later? In the chapter that is in press in the Mash and Barkley 3rd edition of Handbook of Child Abnormal Psychology, there are 9 cohorts that started following the children as young as age 5 that have now been followed for up to 20 years. And we're seeing a lot of homotypic continuity. Children that showed manic and depressive episodes in childhood, relapse in adolescence, continue to show high rates of episode in adulthood. So a project that Anna Van Meter, who was a graduate student here at the University of North Carolina, completed, was a meta-analysis looking at the entire world's epidemiological literature in children and adolescents, asking 3 important questions. How common is bipolar disorder in children and teenagers around the world? Is the rate increasing in the community? Over the same 20-year period that Moreno and Olson said, this has become 40 times more common in clinical diagnoses. Is it actually increasing in the community? And how much more are we seeing in the United States than in the rest of the world? Anna looked at 1,500 hits, went through the titles and the abstracts. She found 12 studies that actually reported data on hypomanic and manic symptoms in children and teenagers. So she meta-analyzed those 12 studies, 13,000 children. May I have a drum roll, please? The answers to the 3 questions are 2%, it's not increasing, and it's not more common in the United States than the rest of the world. Those are 3 very surprising answers. I heard a wow to the 2%. 2%, when I take a step back, that's higher than I expected. That also, as we benchmark it, that's saying it's about twice as common as autism. It's about 40% as common as ADHD. It's about 1/3 as common as depression. And the teenage data and the adult data are suggesting that's probably about right. Probably about 1/3 of severe mood issues are likely to be somewhere on the bipolar spectrum. So that 2% figure is sort of lining up with where we would expect it to based on other epidemiological benchmarks. While this paper was in press, Canada published their epidemiological study, Kozloff et al. So the Canadian data were not included in the meta-analysis. What would you guess the rate of bipolar disorder is in Canada? 2%. 2.1%. This is independent replication of the finding of the meta-analysis. When that paper got published, I called my father up, who is a research chemist, and I said, Dad, Canada just published their results. They line up exactly with what my student's meta-analysis found. And he said, son, it's like you're doing science or something. That 2% figure is actually higher than the 40-fold increase that Moreno found. That was about a 1 in 200 to a 1 in 100 rate of diagnosis. So the epidemiologist in the audience would say, well, yeah, that looks like the clinicians are correcting for previously having been trained not to look for this, and they're starting to get close to the right ballpark for this. So the epidemiological data say, no, this is not a US-only phenomenon, despite the way that that's how we often think about it, how we often frame the discussion. And when we compare videotapes of cases, when we read vignettes of cases, the cases that are getting diagnosed bipolar in Korea or Europe, we look at those and say, yeah, that looks like what I would call mania in the US as well. When we see differences in rates, it's possible that it's differences in the diagnostic criteria. A lot of the rest of the world is using the International Classification of Diseases, not DSM. Often they have the same criteria, but they don't for bipolar disorder. Could be big differences in treatment seeking, could be differences in the healthcare system. Very likely, one of the least exciting explanations is differences in training, and I think that's one of the biggest slices of the pie here. Dubica showed that with vignettes, and Mackin showed it playing videotapes of two adults getting interviewed. How severe were your manic symptoms? And there were huge differences depending on whether the rater trained in Great Britain or the United States or India. Everyone's watching exactly the same videotape. This should be an inter-rater reliability task. What country would you guess rated the person most manic? How many think the United States? How many think Britain? How many think India? What country do you think rated them least manic? How many think the United States? How many think India? How many think Britain? America rated both patients the most manic. Britain rated both patients the least manic. India agreed with the US on one and was right in the middle on the other. Everyone's watching the same videotape. This study led to a joke. If you get hypomanic, mildly manic in Britain, what do they call it? You're acting like a Yank. So it's a difference in training, even if you're looking at exactly the same videotape, 20-point differences in how severe they rate the behavior. It also is possible that there really is more bipolar disorder in some parts of the world than other parts. We know that the epidemiology of heart disease and high blood pressure are not evenly distributed around the world. Different types of cancer, not evenly distributed around the world. So we know that the genes of risk may not be evenly spread, and the environmental factors may not be evenly spread around the world. So I'm going to tell a story of one gene. This is not a bipolar gene. This is a gene that we would like to bring in for further questioning. This is a gene of interest, and there have been some positive studies with bipolar disorder. There have been a lot of positive studies with ADHD. This is a gene, we all have a version of this gene, and there's several different single nucleotide polymorphisms of it. And one variant of it changes the way that our brain metabolizes dopamine, and it changes our levels of sensation seeking. That high sensation seeking variant is not evenly distributed around the world. And this makes me go, huh. As we look at this map, what we see is that in the Rift Valley, this gene is very, very rare, that high sensation seeking version. And the prevalence of it spreads or increases as we move across the map of human migration. What we think happened was hundreds of thousands of years ago, our mitochondrial maternal great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother had two kids, and one of them was the first one born with that high sensation-seeking version. And that ancestor turned to our other ancestors and said, Rift Valley, cool, wonder what outside? And the rest of our ancestors were like, no, not particularly. And the high sensation seeker said, must find out. And then they moved into Europe and Asia, and then the high sensation seeker said, do you wonder what's on the other side of the land bridge? And the rest of our Asian ancestors and European ancestors said, are you kidding? That's ice and rocks and polar bears. But the high sensation seeker said, got to find out. So then they moved to Napa Valley, Sonoma. If they had just held on to that real estate for another 13,000 years, we would all, and they're like, yeah, this is nice. But the high sensation seeker said, yeah, it is nice, but aren't you getting bored? And the people that stayed there said, no, this is great. This is so much better than we thought it would be with all the polar bears and everything. But the high sensation seeker said, I got to find out what's on the other side of the mountains, of the jungle, of the Amazon, of the jungle, of the mountains. Until you get to Tierra del Fuego, that's the end of the road. You can't walk any further. 3 out of 4 people indigenous to the Tierra del Fuego region have the high sensation-seeking allele of the dopamine gene. So the genes of risk don't have to be evenly distributed around the world, and environmental risk factors also don't have to be evenly distributed around the world. So one obvious risk factor that has changed a lot around the world recently, and the United States has been leading the way with this, is obesity. And obesity for mood disorders is a quadruple whammy. Obesity is associated with bipolar disorder independent of the effects of medication that may increase your weight. We think that there's a direct mechanism here. We know that obesity causes heart disease by triggering an inflammatory cytokine response. Abdominal fat stresses our immune system, raises the inflammatory response, and it actually starts to aggravate blood vessels in the heart. It turns out it's doing the same thing to the blood vessels in the brain. And so research here and at Duke University and around the world, a lot in Australia, is looking at reducing inflammatory response as a way of preventing relapse or increasing treatment response to bipolar disorder. So we have a direct mechanism where obesity may actually be stressing the brain, and a lot of literature showing an association with depression, with mania, with psychosis. Obesity also is driving down the age of onset of puberty. So we have a secular trend where now 20% of 8-year-old girls are entering puberty. And all of those hormone changes that are associated with puberty are happening before the brain is ready now. So I have 2 daughters who are now 12 and 14. Both of them hit puberty around 10. That hormone cascade is happening around 8, 9, 10 in the United States. Used to be happening around 15. If you go to rural China, if you go to places in the world that do not have a westernized diet, puberty is still happening around 15, 16. So the brain, the emotional regulation centers of the brain, they don't really start myelinating and upgrading until 14 to early 20s. So the hormones are hitting and the brain's going, geez, that's kind of ahead of schedule. The emotion regulation centers, we can't speed that up. That's not going to come online for another 5, 7 years. And puberty has already started. And then we think about the family and the peer group and the environment. So the brain's not ready. Daddy's not ready either. And so all the social changes that are happening are happening way before the family and the peer group and everyone else are ready to deal with that. So the epidemiological data are saying we're seeing similar rates around the world, but we're seeing some regional differences, and we're starting to tie that back to things like changes in fish consumption, changes in obesity, changes in other risk factors. The other thing that I want us all to keep in mind is when we're talking about bipolar, we're not talking about one diagnosis. We're not talking about one illness. So DSM-4 and DSM-5, when you talk about bipolar, it's labeling at least 4 different categories that the person might meet criteria for. Bipolar 1, bipolar 2, cyclothymic disorder, bipolar not otherwise specified. They changed the name for this, but kept the criteria exactly the same. Literally a copy from DSM-4, paste into DSM-5, change the label at the top of the page. Where we have most of our evidence is about bipolar 1. Epidemiologists would say that's really awkward because in all the prevalence studies, bipolar 1 is the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more cyclothymic disorder. There's a lot more bipolar NOS floating around out there. The debate that we've been having as clinicians is, should we conceptualize this as bipolar? Should we be using similar treatments that we would for bipolar 1? And the clinicians are saying a little help here because 4 out of 5 of the cases that are bipolar-ish are doing this spectrum sort of thing. They're not, I agree, they're not clearly bipolar 1, but that's what we have all the data about. What am I supposed to be doing to help them to stabilize? Bipolar disorder has been a big tease in terms of the genetics. We've known for decades this is the most heritable of the major mental illnesses, but we've not been able to find the gene for it. The reason is because there isn't one. Here we're looking at the largest genome-wide associational study that's been done. And what we've seen is that bipolar disorder, like heart disease, has multiple genes of risk. But unlike heart disease, each of the genes is only jacking up the risk by a factor of 3, 4, maybe 5, versus this one, whatever that SNP is, you really don't want it. That's GeneZilla. That's increasing your risk of a heart attack by a factor of 15. So this idea of there are dozens or hundreds of genes that are each contributing a little bit of risk fits in with a spectrum sort of model. There would be very few people that would have had the bad luck to collect 50 or 80 of these high-risk versions of the genes. There are going to be a lot more people that will have 20, 30 of the genes of risk, and their biology is going to set them up to act bipolar-ish, but not clearly all the way manic. And then the part which is intriguing about bipolar disorder is that in family studies, low doses of this may not be a bad thing. When we look at families of people with bipolar illness, many members of the family are more productive, more creative, more accomplished than an average person from the general population. And people with bipolar disorder, when they live well with it, it's also associated with extreme creativity and productivity. So these genes are not intrinsically bad. Kay Jamison, a psychologist who has written her autobiography about living with bipolar disorder, in the concluding chapter says, when we figure out the genes, she's going to argue we shouldn't delete them. We shouldn't figure out how to eliminate them. The human experience would be impoverished if we could erase bipolar from the human experience. So she would say the challenge is, how do we manage this? How do we ride the tiger, not how do we eliminate it? So bipolar NOS is at the bottom of the pyramid. What that means is that this is going to be the most common presentation. The epidemiologists are saying, yeah, we see this the most in our studies. Clinicians are saying, yeah, that's what I'm seeing a lot of at the clinic. It's not clearly manic, but they're bipolar features. There's things that are making me worried. We used to call that bipolar NOS in DSM-4. DSM-5 copied the criteria, pasted them, and said we're now going to call it other specified bipolar and related disorder. But the criteria are exactly the same. So, all right, epidemiologists are saying this is what you really need to pay attention to. It's going to be 3 to 5 times as common as bipolar 1. What are we looking for? Well, there are 3 different ways that DSM talks about meeting criteria for bipolar OS-BRD. One is having manic or hypomanic symptoms that don't last long enough. They don't meet the duration criteria. And as a clinician, this is the most common issue that I see. We get hypomanias that don't last 4 days. We get manias that don't last a week. Another possibility is repeated hypomania without a depressive episode. They never get manic, because that would be an upgrade to bipolar 1, and they never get depressed. These people do exist, and they do not want our help. You never see them at a clinic. They're doing fine, and then they get better than fine, don't need as much sleep, a little bit more creative, but not getting in trouble. And then they get back to fine, never get depressed, never get manic. Where we find them is in family studies, so unaffected relatives, and in studies of college students, where we look at subsyndromal mood symptoms, and we find this group that do fine or better than fine, but not getting in trouble, and back to fine. Their roommates can't stand living with them because they can't keep up. The person will go out to the parties, and then they still get up. And they go to class, and they're making great grades, and it's like they're an Energizer bunny with an extra battery pack. And then the third definition would be manic symptoms, but not quite enough. My nickname for this is one brick short of a load of clear mania. This is the favorite definition of epidemiologists because you've already gathered all the data, so it's very easy to reanalyze it and say, what happens if we have elated mood plus just 2 symptoms or plus 1 symptom? So this is actually the one that we have the most research about. And what the epidemiologists would say is that one brick short is really impairing. So here we're looking at an epidemiological study done in high school in Oregon, and one brick short is receiving treatment, attempting suicide, having problems with friends, family, and at school. all at the same rate as teenagers with full-blown major depression. Only thing that they found that was worse was bipolar 1, bipolar 2. Looking at adult data, people, Kiskell and Judd, were aware of Lewinson's analysis of the epidemiological data. So they went to an adult epidemiological sample, reanalyzed that, and said, okay, what happens if we look for one brick short in an adult epidemiological study? 5 times as common as bipolar 1, also very impairing, doubles your risk of being unmarried on welfare, quadruples your risk of attempting suicide, receiving outpatient services, quintuples your risk of hospitalization and suicidal ideation. 5 times as common, very impairing. What about the not enough duration? What about the presentation that I say as a clinician? That's what I see a lot. The course and outcome of bipolar youth study started with children who were 6 to 12 years old and followed them up every 6 months and has been renewed multiple times. So they have published the 6-year follow-up data at this point. When we start off with 92 children that were NOS, not clearly manic, never clearly depressed, and then follow up with them almost 2 years later, it divides roughly into thirds. So we see a third that recover, but by recovery I don't mean they're fine, there's nothing wrong. It's recovery into not a mood disorder. Oh, it's just ADHD. Oh, it's just post-traumatic stress disorder. Another third continue to show that mood junk, where their mood is up and down. They've got very pronounced mood swings, but it's not lasting 4 days or a week or 2 weeks of up or down. And then another third progressed to clearly bipolar 2. They had a nice, clear major depression. Now we know what we're working with. Or they had a really nice, clear mania. Now we know what we're working with. The 4-year data and 5-year data, what we see is very few people stay off the mood spectrum. If they had substantial mood issues between the ages of 6 and 12, very likely that they'll relapse into mood at some point. And we see the number that have a full-blown major depression or mania creeping up. The 5-year data, again, very few people staying off of the mood spectrum. Number creeping up to close to 45% in the 5-year data. But what's interesting is that we have a group that is showing that mood junk, up, down, not lasting for 4 days, a week, 2 weeks at a pop. 2 years later, they're still doing that. 4 years later, 5 years later, they're still doing that. What we don't know, there are 3 different developmental hypotheses on the table now. Hypothesis number 1 is follow them long enough and eventually everyone will clearly get bipolar. Hypothesis 2 is that middle group, that middle third, that their mood was very dysregulated, but not clearly depressed, not clearly manic. If you see that at the beginning and then 2 years later, the mood is up, down, 4 years later, up, down, 5 years later, up, down, maybe that is what we're working with. Anyone who's worked with adults, what would be the diagnostic label we might use for that presentation where their mood is up, down, it's black, it's white, I love you, I hate you, you're the best therapist ever, you're fired. Borderline. So Zimmerman and Ruggiero are saying, you know, maybe what we're seeing is a trait, emotion dysregulation, which if the person were over 18 years old, we would say, you've had this most of your life. The forecast is continued mood swings, and we would describe that as borderline. The most provocative possibility, though, is that maybe people will grow out of it. Maybe I was trained completely wrong. I was taught bipolar, that's an R-rated diagnosis. Under 17, not supposed to be admitted. Youngstrom, if you go on and work mostly with adults, you'll see bipolar. But if you're working with kids, you forget about it. I trained outside of Philly. Forget about it. Not going to see a lot of bipolar. What we know about brain development now, emotion regulation centers, impulsivity, attention to cues of reward, all of those are things that are characteristic of childhood and adolescence. Maybe it's possible that some people that have behavior that looks manic in childhood when the orbital prefrontal cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex fully myelinate, then they may finally have some breaks. They may be able to inhibit. And so they got manic when they were 11 or 13, and they aren't going to get manic again. This is a radical proposal. This essentially is saying DSM has had it upside down for several decades, but this really changes the message, if it's true, from one of, there's no hope, we don't have a cure for this, the best that we can do is help you manage the symptoms, pray for remission, to, if we can stabilize this, we can change the trajectory that you're on, and you may be able to do very well. Should we be worried about bipolar NOS, or should we take a wait-and-see approach? The COBE data paint a grim picture of NOS. So here we're looking at everyone starts off ill. How long do they stay ill? How long does it take them to recover, get out of episode? And what we see is that bipolar 1, bipolar 2 remit significantly faster than bipolar NOS. Bipolar NOS spends more days ill per year. They have less good treatment response to things that should work for bipolar 1. And we don't have any psychotherapy studies that have looked specifically at treatment for bipolar NOS. Very high rate of progression to bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and they're thinking about suicide, attempting suicide at very high rates. So this is a very serious condition, very difficult for us to recognize, particularly because the installed base of practitioners were trained, forget about it. So the clinical take-home messages, bipolar disorder often onsets in adolescence. And when you talk with people who are skeptical about the diagnosis, where a lot of the field is right now is saying, well, if we're talking about it in teenagers, then I would believe it. But think about when puberty is starting now. If we're talking about an 8-year-old, that could be post-puberty. We'll often see it present first as a depressed episode. It affects at least 1 in 100 in the general European population, 2 in 100 in epidemiological samples around the world. Spectrum is at least 5 times as common as bipolar 1, still highly impairing. And if we're working in a clinical setting, all of the rates that I've been talking about so far are if we just took the phone book and divided it up and said, you call 10 people, you call 10 people, you call, and we interview them and say, have you ever had a hypomania or a mania? Versus people coming to the clinic saying, I need help. My school has expelled me. My wife is ready to leave me. I need help managing my mood. The question, which I want to look at through a developmental psychopathology and a developmental science perspective, is do all of these kids really have bipolar disorder? Especially when we start talking about bipolar NOS or OS-BRD, we've got a fuzzy presentation. Are we sure that these kids all have bipolar disorder? And I want to use a canine analogy to make concrete both the strength and the weakness of the way that we have been approaching this through DSM. So DSM realized that clinicians, when we do this completely freestyle, when we say, come in and tell me what's bugging you, and you tell me your story and I get to think about it however I want, if Dr. Kaufman or Dr. Hussong interviews the same person, they're going to ask different questions, they're going to get a different story, they're going to arrive at a different diagnosis. So DSM said we can't keep having people labeling things completely differently. So we're going to focus on symptoms regardless of etiology, regardless of process. We're going to focus on symptoms so that we can all get on the same page about diagnosis. And that improved our reliability a lot. So the DSM approach is going to focus on the symptoms and the associated features, not the etiology, not the trajectory over time. So it is, in a way, going the opposite direction from developmental science, where we're trying to understand process and mediators and change over time. It improves the reliability, but all the people that were advocating this in DSM-3, 3R are saying, we're going to need to do work to show validity for this sort of approach. This risks lumping. The developmental science idea of equifinality. We could have different pathways that all lead to what looks like the same behavior. And so we may be calling a whole bunch of things bipolar that have very different pathways leading to that behavior. And it also risks splitting, where we could have multiple diagnoses that may reflect the same underlying causal process. So the analogy which I'm going to make is if we had to use DSM to diagnose wolf, what would that look like? And wolf is very topical in North Carolina now because wolves are moving back into western North Carolina. So if you have small children or small pets, you may start to wonder, how would I recognize a wolf? I was walking my dog last summer, and we were cutting through past the Bible Church on Irwin Road, and I saw what I'm pretty sure was a coyote. Not a wolf, but not 100% sure. And my dog I love her, and she would not win a fight with a wolf. So I'm really curious. How would I diagnose a wolf? Now, if we were going to use a DSM type approach, we would get criteria to improve our reliability diagnosing wolf, and they would look something like this. Wolf, criterion A, must be a mammal that meets criteria for at least 3 of the following symptoms. Eats meat, has 4 legs, has a furry tail, keen sense of smell, its ears stand upright. There was a National Geographic article talking about how ears coming down is a sign of domestication. And it's nocturnal. And DSM always says, just having the symptoms isn't enough, has to be associated with impairment, has to be causing problems in at least one setting. Everyone feel like this is a pretty clear operational definition? I see 1 no, several yeses. All right, is this a wolf? Well, it's a mammal, so we meet the A criterion. And we have several B criteria. Just based on this snapshot of the behavior, we can't be sure about the furry tail thing. And we're not sure about the 4 legs criterion. But DSM says that's okay. We understand that clinical practice is complicated. People don't always give you the whole picture. And we have enough information here to go with the 3 out of 6. So the picture was taken at night. The ears are standing up. And so, yeah, we've got enough. Diagnose wolf. What about this? Is this a wolf? It's a mammal. And we've got 3 B criteria. So it's standing on 4 legs. It's got standing ears. It's got the hairy tail. What about this? Is this a wolf? This one is actively denying wolf. No, I'm not a wolf. I'm grandma. What about this? These are my daughters. Is that a wolf that they're standing next to? What about this? Is this early onset wolf disorder? And we're not sure, just looking at this snapshot, whether it's going to grow up to be a husky or a wolf or something else. According to DSM, those are all wolves. Those are all wolves. And we played according to strict DSM criteria. We checked criterion A. We asked about all 6 of the other symptoms, and all of those met at least 3 of the B criteria. So we could have excellent arguments, and we've been having excellent arguments about trying to refine the subtype. And so we could say, okay, we need to add a rule out. Rule out Disney character. Or talk about in my clinical experience, the non-meat-eating subtype of wolf appears to be different in its developmental course than the meat-eating type. And it seems like maybe it's associated with stripes. And then someone else that has worked with horses is like, no, stripes are not essential. And so that's exactly where we've been with pediatric bipolar disorder, arguing about, are there cardinal symptoms? Are there symptoms that you must have? Are there symptoms that if you have 2 of these, then you can be sure that it really is bipolar? Looking at this through a developmental science lens, we know this is an oversimplification. When we talk about something like irritable mood, there are a whole bunch of different things that could be leading to that. There could be biological differences, like difficult temperament. There could be important differences in early environment or emotion perception, or the family didn't teach them good emotion regulation strategies. We could think about mood as also being related to this, but there are a whole bunch of other environmental and biological things, other clinical issues that also are associated with irritable mood. And with bipolar disorder, irritability could change its flavor, but still be showing up whether the person is manic or depressed. And so this is one of the arguments, like, do stripes matter, or does meat eating matter? Does having an episode matter for diagnosing bipolar? And if they're irritable when they're manic, their energy is high, they're focused on cues of reward, they've got things that they want to do. They've got places that they want to go. And the Tasmanian devil is a beautiful poster cartoon for manic irritability, because once he starts spinning, once he gets revved up, he's going to rip through anything, anyone that gets in his way. And it's not because he's mean. It's not because he's antisocial. That's just what happens once he starts spinning. And Oscar the Grouch is a very good example of depressed irritability, where the energy level is low. Often he doesn't even have enough energy to get out of the can, and he's grouchy. And it's a very prickly sort of irritability, but very, very low energy. So bipolar could be irritable when they're up, irritable when they're down, and where the field has been for 5 years is struggling with, do those look different? Are we still talking about the same illness? Gay Carlson talks about how these kids have always been with us. And 50 years ago, there was not a diagnosis of ADHD. There was minimal brain dysfunction, which sounds like a terrible name, but very similar to how we're conceptualizing it. There's something subtle different about the brain. It's changing your behavior in the classroom, and it's not something that would necessarily show up on all of the neurocog tests that we have. And then there was classic bipolar disorder, and then there was early onset schizophrenia, and we used to lump all of autism, all of Asperger's, all that just to be, oh yeah, schizophrenic. And then we went through DSM-3R, DSM-4, and we tightened the criteria for schizophrenia. And so now we would look at these same presentations and say, that's not schizophrenia, that's autism, that's Asperger's. And we look at these kids that have always been with us, and we would say, that's not ADHD. Their moods are extremely dysregulated. They've got very powerful mood swings. They blow up. And that's not garden variety ADHD. What do we call that? And Gay's point is, these kids need help. And the epidemiologist would say, we agree. That's a very common presentation, and these kids need help. Should we lump this together with bipolar disorder, or should we keep it separate? A nickname for classic bipolar disorder, with this week they're manic, this month they're depressed, is Cade's disease. This is what the adults, Nasir Ghami, Joe Calabrese are using as the shorthand for this is bipolar classic. The reason that their nickname for it is Cade's disease is because it responds really well to lithium. And Cade was the person who discovered the anti-manic effects of lithium. So what they're saying is if it looks like the bipolar described in the textbook, it's probably going to respond pretty well to lithium. People working with adults with bipolar disorder often see much more complicated presentations, not the textbook presentation, often doesn't respond as well to lithium. Makes us wonder, have we been using one label and mixing different etiologies together? When we start thinking about this developmentally, using a developmental science lens, we can start to see how there might actually be a lot of continuity, a lot of homotypic continuity across development that appears to be changing labels that we would assign to it. So if we have people that look like textbook bipolar, the research is establishing they often show classic Cade's disease bipolar disorder in adolescence or early adulthood. But the people that have that emotion dysregulation, not quite more than just ADHD, could be rapid cycling, could be increased risk for substance use, could be borderline personality, like we were talking about with the COBE data. And what we see is, again, when we focus on the level of the trait or the behavior, we can see a lot of continuity across development, but the labels that we use as a field change as you have your 18th birthday, you hand in the keys for your conduct disorder, and if you're doing the same behavior, you get the keys for a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. Your personality didn't actually change. It's the label that we would use that changed. Thinking again from a developmental science perspective, all right, is this early onset wolf disorder? We don't have the data yet to be able to say for sure when we come back in several years, will it look like this, or will it look like a husky, is a very high-functioning animal. But the point when I look at the same research, same data from a developmental science perspective is we already know that there is a fair amount of continuity, and we can rule out a lot of possibilities. We're sure that this is not going to grow up to look like that, and we're sure that it's not going to grow up to look like that. And on the basis of the same data, we can say with confidence, these people that were showing severe mood dysregulation in childhood, they're not going to grow up to just be fine. They're not going to grow up to only have a very limited social phobia. They're on a different trajectory. They're on a different pathway. Third way of thinking about this is making a metaphor to a tree, very common metaphor in developmental science. So here we're looking at the ugly tree of bipolar disorder. So this is the bipolar trunk, and it's got its roots in a whole bunch of nonspecific risk factors. So we've talked about genes of interest for bipolar disorder. People working with ADHD say, no, that's my gene. People working with schizophrenia say, no, that's my gene. And so we have these nonspecific genetic and biological risk factors. In utero exposure to substances, that's not going to be a good feature. It's going to increase your risk for a whole variety of different issues. Exposure to trauma, all of these things are increasing your risk of developing bipolar, but also other conditions. And if it really is bipolar disorder, it's going to express itself in a variety of different ways. So all of these are symptom clusters that we see increased likelihood of manifesting when we're looking at bipolar disorder. And you can squint at this and say, okay, this is the externalizing side of the tree, and this is the internalizing side of the tree. But what we're looking at is multifinality. We're looking at one underlying set of processes that are manifesting in a whole variety of different behaviors. Is there a sharp boundary between bipolar disorder and ordinary functioning? A lot of times we think that there are two different kinds of people in the world, those that have the disease and those that don't. We've looked at multiple data sets using statistical methods that are designed to test what are the data trying to tell us? Is this two categories, or is it all on a continuum? Height. We could describe it as there are two kinds of people in the world, the tall and the short. Or we could say height is something that everyone has a different amount of, and then test, which is a better fit to the data. So looking at manic symptoms, what would you guess? How many people think there are two categories, those that have it, those that don't? How many would think it's dimensional? How many just want me to tell you the answer? So here we're looking at these two lines are simulated data. If we had a category, then we would expect the data to fall somewhere in between these lines, and this is the data. If manic symptoms actually were distributed as a dimension, it would fall somewhere inside these two lines. So looking at it this way, that's supporting the dimensional model. Here we're using a different statistical method, same sort of rationale. If it's a categorical model, we would expect it to fit within these two lines. If it's a dimensional model, it should fit within these lines. Once again, dimensional model. We're going to look at the same data, third different set of analyses. And here we've got what it would look like with a categorical model in between these, and in between these lines is a dimensional model. So here we're seeing a dimensional model again. And then a fourth time, here we see evidence for a categorical model. Not. Just wanted to see if you were following, if you were awake. Here again, the data look like a dimensional model. So looking at the same data using 4 different types of statistical analysis, what we're seeing is dimensional, dimensional, dimensional. This replicates the work of Prashandaro and colleagues going into epidemiological data sets. So what all the data here are saying is actually the spectrum idea really fits the data better. Manic symptoms and mood symptoms are something that we all possess to different degrees. Another way of thinking about this is that we're accumulating different risk factors, which could be biological, could be social, could be developmental experiences, and how they pile up, how they stack up, may at some point push us to a level where it's starting to cause problems, and then we would say, okay, we need to help, we need to intervene. We're going to call that pathological, but it really is just a question of degree, not a categorical shift in what we're working with. And once you start looking at the literature through that lens, you start to see, wow, people with bipolar disorder are showing differences across a variety of traits that are likely to, again, be a question of degree, not categorical differences. So looking at the big 5 factors of personality, we see that people with bipolar disorder have higher levels of neuroticism, now we call emotional instability. That's not very surprising. Lower levels of extroversion, that's surprising, but these are people that have had more than one mood episode, and they get very embarrassed, very ashamed of what happened when they were manic, and so they become much more withdrawn. More openness to experience, more hostile, less agreeable, also not very surprising. Very low levels of conscientiousness, very chaotic, disorganized. Also, when we think about it, not terribly surprising. Another thing which I think is a real strength of the developmental science approach and has been a real gap in the way that we've thought about bipolar disorder for decades, is not paying enough attention to the social environment and to the family in particular. Now, if there was someone who had written DSM-4 in the room, they would say, that's not true, Youngstrom. We've got a whole axis devoted to environmental issues. The 4th axis of our 5-axis system is all about environmental factors. If you look at DSM-4, it's 900 pages long. How many pages are talking about environmental issues? 1.5. So it's there, they're right, yeah, axis 4, remember to think about that, but it is a fraction of a percent of the ink that they use in DSM-4. Here's the punchline. What happened with DSM-5? They got rid of the axes. There's no axis 4. So we don't even get our 1.5 pages to talk about family environment. Now, I was trained as a family therapist, and this is a very rich way of thinking about what's happening in the family. So here we're looking at, so circles are women and squares are men. So we're looking at mom with a history of mood disorder, and she passes on some of the genes of risk to her daughter. And if mom gets stressed and depressed again, she's going to shut down. She's not going to do as good a job actively managing her child's behavior, running the home environment. And so as a family therapist, I would say, okay, as mom's relapsing, that's shutting her down. Her parenting strategies are becoming less effective. The whole family is under more stress now. This also is creating a void. Someone's no longer filling the parental role. And if the child has mood symptoms, they're likely to challenge. They're likely to push. And so they might move up and they might start trying to boss mom around. And so you're going to have more conflict, more fighting about things like bedtime. Can they keep using the cell phone all night? All these sorts of issues. So DSM would say, well, yes, that's the genes of risk getting passed on. But that's a gross oversimplification. The whole family dynamics are changing, and they're changing in a way that unfolds over time. And so really looking at the family environment is going to be a much more powerful way of thinking about this. Last 2 points which I want to make thinking about a developmental science perspective on bipolar disorder. One is making a prediction about what we're going to see over the next 5 years. If you take 100 people with careful diagnoses of bipolar disorder, they're not all going to have the same disease. They're not all going to have the same trajectory, not going to have the same process. What we're going to see is a lot of examples like velocardiofacial syndrome. So this is a microdeletion of several genes from a chromosome. The name is reflecting the fact that it changes the person's face during infancy, during fetal development. Also changes the heart muscle, but also changes their behavior. People with this microdeletion are 20 to 30 times more likely to develop psychosis. But this is not the gene for schizophrenia. This is not the microdeletion for psychotic bipolar disorder. It only affects 1 in 2,000 to 1 in 4,000 of the general population. So compare that to what the epidemiologists are saying. If it's 20 in 1,000 that might have bipolar disorder, we might have one that has velocardiofacial syndrome. 19 times out of 20, it's going to be a different process. It's going to be a different set of mediators, a different trajectory. So it'll identify a subset at risk for psychosis. They may have a very different treatment response. The narrative, which is getting told around this, is personalized medicine. So we will understand according to personalized medicine, we will figure out what's the microdeletion, what's the difference in brain circuitry, what is it that's unique about you which is leading to these behaviors. Let's tailor the treatment to that particular issue. The other way of thinking about this is thinking in terms of dimensions. And we just saw a whole bunch of data saying dimensional is where it's at. This is what we want to be doing. And the research domain criteria are saying, let's think in terms of some basic dimensions that may cut across multiple disorders and explain why we're seeing continuity across many of these. So positive valence, negative valence, cognitive functioning, social dominance, circadian regulation. Could we apply these to bipolar disorder and make some predictions? Absolutely. So if the person's manic, I would expect to see really high levels of that positive valence trait and low levels of the negative valence trait. They're very disinhibited, so they're not going to be anxious and worried about what they're saying. We've seen evidence of cognitive impairment. We've seen evidence of high social dominance. They're going to be very assertive. They're going to try to take charge of the situation, and their sleep gets disrupted. So this is what bipolar looks like, right? Well, if we talk to the same person when they're depressed, it all flips. Now their positive valence scores are very low. Their negative valence scores are very high. They're still having trouble with cognitive tasks, but when we really break it down and put it under a microscope, here we're seeing more divergent thinking, more creativity, and also more distraction. Here we're seeing more rumination and more sort of slowed down functioning. The social dominance flips, and they become very withdrawn. They become very rejection sensitive, and their sleep is disrupted, but here they're not sleeping. Here they're sleeping too much. So what does bipolar disorder look like? Well, it's either one thing or the opposite, or you're fine. Any questions? Now, this is not new. This is Kreplin writing 100 years ago, saying when you look at bipolar disorder, it disrupts your mood in green, your energy level in red, and your intellect, your cognitive functioning in black. And it will sometimes accelerate them, sometimes slow them down. And it doesn't have to affect all of your systems at the same time. They could be out of sync with each other. And so 100 years ago, he was describing pure mania, pure depression, and a whole bunch of mixed states that we've spent another 100 years struggling with and not making a whole lot of progress. I got misty when I saw this figure because it was so elegant as a description of what I'd seen as a clinician and what I'd seen in research data, and it's 100 years old. We haven't made any progress since then. This is another slide that makes me go, huh, this is what you were asking about at lunch. These data are showing that the younger we look in bipolar disorder, the more that the presentation changes. These are 900 inpatients, and when we look at people who are in their 60s, what we see is that they're almost always depressed, very likely to show depression, unlikely to show mania, or a mixed presentation. The younger we go, the less we see pure depression, the more that we see mania, but especially the more that we see these mixed presentations. What makes me go, huh, is these aren't American data. These are European data. These are 100 years old. These are from Kreplin's book, Manic Depressive Insanity and Paranoia. So this is not some marketing gimmick by pharmaceutical companies. This is before there were any medications. For as long as there's been a diagnosis of manic depression, careful observers have said it looks different younger. And what we're more likely to see younger is more mood dysregulation. And as the person grows, they're more likely to develop pure depressions, some pure manias, but especially pure depression. This has led to, and this is unpublished, you are the first audience to hear me talk about this in a group setting, in a public format. This has led to what I call the big sigma hypothesis. Bipolar disorder is characterized by fluctuation, not just mood swings, also swings in cognition, also swings in sleep. But the characteristic, what makes it bipolar disorder, is the swings, not always being up, not always being down, not always being in the middle, but the propensity to swing. If we have a lot of group data, the hypothesis that I would make is if you have people with unipolar depression, people with bipolar disorder, people with ADHD, the group with bipolar disorder may not show different averages, but they're going to have a bigger standard deviation because you're going to have some people who are hypomanic, some people who are depressed, some people who are fine at the time that they completed the interview. And then individual data, again, what we would expect to see is big swings, big sigma, big shifts in mood and energy over time. And the way that we would look for this would be using PDAs or smartphones and asking, how are you feeling now? How's your mood and energy been today, tomorrow, the next day? We have the technology now to do what Kreplin was doing with a pencil and paper 100 years ago, but take it out of the clinic into real-world settings, into the schools. Is there any reason why nature might tolerate? Why would we have a gene that would make our moods more unstable? Why would we have a gene that would make our energy or our sleep more unstable? There are two ways of achieving spectacular success. One is hard work. The other is taking big swings, going for it. So you could increase your underlying ability through lots and lots of hard work. One of my children's favorite musicians right now is Macklemore, singing about 10,000 hours. That Malcolm Gladwell idea of really investing a lot of time and energy to raise the mean, raise your personal ability. But the other way is go for broke, go all in. And bipolar disorder is swinging wildly in terms of goal-directed behavior. This is Sherry Johnson's work, Lauren Alloy, Lynn Abramson's work, motivation. And that's associated when it goes well. When you get all of that pitch, you're going to take it out of the park. You're going to have spectacular creativity, tremendous productivity, outstanding success when it works. And when it doesn't, depression and failure and rejection. So showing it as a picture, here we have the normal curve where we've got the typical distribution of whatever it is that we're talking about, creativity, productivity, mood. And then we could draw a line here and say, okay, what would it take to get up over the 97th percentile or the 99th percentile for this trait? And one possibility is raise the mean. But what bipolar disorder is doing is saying swing wildly. And for all of the statisticians in the audience, this is a platykurtic distribution. We are thickening the tail. We have over-dispersion. The standard deviation is much larger. And so then way more than 2.5% of the time, someone with bipolar is going to have spectacular success. But the price they pay is they also have more spectacular failure. And then in red in the middle, I was trying to remember, who was it that T.S. Eliot wrote about that was like the fuddy-duddy, stick in the mud, never took any chances? That would be the opposite strategy of just stay very close to average. Don't take any big risks. You won't have a lot of disappointments. Those people are out there too. Bipolar is going the opposite way. Swing big, take big cuts. You'll have more spectacular success, more risk of spectacular failure. This has implications for what sort of statistical models we want to use. So if we're going to keep using ANOVA and comparing groups, look at the standard deviations. Look at the Levine's test of homogeneity of variance. Growth curve modeling and fitting a linear shape is a terrible idea because from a developmental science perspective, these people we don't expect their mood to go in a straight line over the rest of their lives. And we don't expect people to have their depression or have their hypomania at exactly the same age across groups of people. Looking at things like the area under the curve of the life chart or borrowing methods from Tim Troll and other people looking at mood instability and borderline personality disorder, using smartphones and doing experiential sampling is going to be where it's at, I would predict, in terms of really doing a better job modeling, measuring emotion dysregulation and energy dysregulation. So wrapping it up, does bipolar disorder exist in children? Yes, but that doesn't mean what I thought it did. Is it the same as bipolar in adults? Yeah, but there's a huge amount of heterogeneity at every age. 100 teenagers with bipolar, 100 adults, 100 kids with bipolar, they don't all have the same mediators. They don't all have the same process. Rethinking bipolar disorder through a developmental psychopathology lens, through a developmental science lens, I'm convinced this is the way forward. If you have a choice between buying DSM-5 and switching to different categories and definitions of categories versus thinking about developmental trajectories and dimensions and understanding the process, bet on developmental science is a way of moving us forward so that 50 years from now when we look at Kreplin, we're not shaking our heads saying that is so cool and so sad that we have not had more progress. Thank you.
So we have some time for some questions for Dr. Youngstrom. We are live streaming this presentation, so if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring you this mic. It won't magnify your voice, but it'll just make it so our colleagues can hear you.
Eric, that was a tour de force, just amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
One of the questions I had is thinking about, everybody talks about bipolar in semesters about emotion regulation, but how striking it is to think about this dysregulation of different systems differentially across people and time. And I wonder if there's something that people who are interested in studying emotion regulation more broadly can learn about the cognitive, social, affective systems and how they come together in thinking about this from the bipolar literature.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really broad question, but thoughts about that? Like what this is telling us about how the systems come together and how emotion regulation itself might push the other systems along.
I think the question about are there things that we could learn from the literature on bipolar disorder and apply to other disorders is absolutely true. So one of my friends and colleagues is Sherry Johnson, who has done tremendous work in bipolar disorder, a lot on cues of reward and how that's related to risk of mania. She she's written an abnormal psychopathology textbook, and they just got done updating it. And she said to me, I am so tired of updating these chapters and having everyone talk about exactly the same brain region or exactly the same gene as if it was unique to them. Anxiety disorders are associated with increased cues of sensitivity to cues of threat and elevated levels of trait negative affectivity. And then you read the depression chapter, and so there's a huge amount of non-specificity. What this means to people who have a different content area that they're interested in is you could read one literature, and whatever's hot in that literature, you could copy and paste and move over to the other. This was the thing that led to NIH being dissatisfied with the DSM approach and saying, let's think about domains and look at how they cut across multiple disorders, multiple levels of analysis. So I think that the question that you asked is exactly why Bruce Cuthbert and Tom Insel are saying we really need to change the way that we think about this to focus more on basic dimensions and processes and see how that explains continuity and discontinuity across what putatively were different disorders. I also think that there will be exceptions. So the velocardiofacial syndrome is an example of something very, very specific. So it's a microdeletion of genes that changes morphology, changes brain functioning, changes a whole bunch of other things. I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. I work a lot with psychiatry. I've grown up with a father who's a chemist, and he keeps saying, boy, what you work with sounds really fuzzy, really complicated. But part of it, too, is that we're working with the uncarved block of what's left. Anytime that we get a really clear process, somebody else steals it. PKU, single gene recessive condition that leads to brain damage and cognitive dysfunction. 50 years ago, we would be working with them and say, I'm not sure why your cognitive ability is impaired, but it clearly is. As soon as we figured out the gene for it, someone else comes in and steals that kid and says, we got this. We'll take care of it. We understand the etiology. Same thing happens anytime we get a really good mechanism, neurology or the geneticist or someone else takes our condition, and we're just left with all of the other impaired cognitive functioning or all of the other emotion dysregulation that we haven't figured out the exact process for. So this is the grumpy bald man talking, saying as soon as we do our good developmental science and we really get it worked out, someone's going to swoop in again and claim that once we do a really good job mapping it. But when I put on my clinician hat or I put on my parent hat, that still's a win, because at the end of the day, the reason that we all went into this work was to help families, regardless of who gets credit.
Other questions?
That was great, Eric. You haven't said anything about sex of child. In this area, do you get differences in gender? And when you were talking about the family piece, there is a literature suggesting that when a mother, say, withdraws from the parenting role, girls may respond quite differently with then different downstream effects than boys. So I just wondered if you have any insights into sex of child.
So the idea of sex of child as being a moderator, I think, is fantastic. And the literature really hasn't systematically explored that in any great depth, which is really great news for you guys, because it means if you're interested, you can review the entire literature quickly. Literally about a week or two to get through the whole thing. And I'm sure there's gold in them Nar Hills. So what DSM and the World Health Organization say is there are no gender differences in the rate of bipolar disorder. And there's zero evidence of sex linkage of any of the traits that we're talking about. So the traditional psychiatry view is the rates are about the same for both genders all around the world, and that's why people haven't gone looking. Interesting fact number one, there's no sex difference in the rate of bipolar 1, cyclothymic disorder, or bipolar NOS in both epidemiological and clinical studies. But bipolar 2 shows up more often in women in clinical samples. What's the definition of bipolar 2? Depressed plus hypomania. Women who are depressed are more likely to ask for help. Men who are depressed are more likely to ask for a drink. So the geneticists say this isn't sex-linked, but we're seeing a difference in treatment seeking. We're seeing a difference in how they frame the problem, how they engage with treatment. Other work suggests that the lifetime rates of bipolar 1 may be the same, but men show more manic episodes over the course of their life, and women show more depressive episodes over the course of their life. And there are two papers that I'm aware of, three papers that I'm aware of, two from our group, showing that women also show higher rates of mixed symptoms, which is when they get hypomanic, they're also more likely to be anxious and have negative affect at the same time. Those, I think, are social processes. I think that it's differences in the relationships. I think it's differences in socialization of emotion regulation. I think that in many cultures it's more okay for a boy to be assertive, aggressive, and impulsive, and those are less likely to be amplified. And so I think that there's a huge amount there, and the field hasn't looked at it yet.
Okay, well, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Dr. Youngstrom, again for coming. We're going to give him a short break before our consortium class starts, so thank you.
Thank you all for coming.